everybody. Good morning, and no shortage of things to talk about. I'm Jake Sherman, a founder of Punchbowl News. Thank you so much for joining us in person and on the live stream. Great crowd on the live stream, I'm sure, for this conversation about restoring America's 5G leadership. A big thank you to CTIA for partnering with us on this event. This morning, Senator Ted Cruz, who I think everybody has heard of, the Republican from Texas and the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, will join me to talk news of the day and the latest on spectrum policy. Afterwards, I'll be joined by CTIA CEO Ajit Pai for a fireside chat. As always, you can find Punchbowl News on social media at Punchbowl News, and we encourage you to share about the conversation wherever you share about conversations. I'd like to welcome Senator Ted Cruz from the state of Texas to the stage. Thank you, sir. We can stop talking about Houston trivia, or we can continue to talk about Houston trivia on stage. Going to start with a few quick news of the day.
By the way, the Rockets will win it all this year.
Well, my wife's from Houston, and we are a torn household between the Nationals, which, as you remember, beat the Houston Astros in the World Series championip.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. And next time, why don't you give me a paper cut and put lemon juice in it?
But let's talk about reconciliation, a decidedly less interesting topic for many, but for us, I think we're very interested. Will this get done by July 4th, in your view?
No.
Okay.
The Senate will be done by July 4th. So, look, in terms of timing, we're in the middle of reconciliation. We're going to get this done.
I agree.
We have to get it done. It is the major vehicle to accomplish the principal mandate from the election. But the Senate will take until July 4th. We'll pass it right before the 4th. The Senate bill is going to be markedly different from the House.
How different? How different are we talking?
Look, lots of ways, and the House did a good job. I'm glad the House got it passed. Getting 218 yeses in the House is incredibly difficult. Mike Johnson is a good friend. He has, I think, the hardest job in all of politics. And so I'm glad they got to yes and sent the bill over. You know, an interesting stat. House Republicans, 60% of them were not there in 2017, the last time we did tax reform. It's complicated, and it takes a long time. And so if you remember 2017,
I do.
I spent hundreds of hours negotiating provisions in that bill. The House passed in 2017 a good bill. It went to the Senate and it got significantly better. And then we went to conference. And
that's what you hear from senators, by the way.
But actually, I can break it down on substance, because I say this as a conservative. It got more conservative. And then it went to conference and it got even better after that. And you are right, that is usually backwards. The normal way it works is the House passes a good bill, the Senate makes it worse, it goes to conference, it gets even worse. So I'm used to the process. It is the single best I've ever seen the legislative process work, was the 2017 tax cut process. I am really hopeful we'll do the same thing again. And so each of the committees, the way reconciliation works is each of the substantive committees is given reconciliation instructions, and the chairman draft their portions of the bill. They do it in consultation with the members of the committee. And then all of those will be put together. And my guess is the Senate bill will track the House bill maybe 60 to 70%. There are a lot of good provisions. A lot of the broad outlines are going to be similar, but it's the Senate. So the Senate's going to do what it damn well wants to do. And that's a good process. And so I think the Senate will vote it out right before the July 4th recess. And then I think it is likely that we will spend the month of July in conference and trying to reconcile the two, because there's going to be, if you assume 2/3 overlap, there's going to be 1/3 differences in just negotiating back and forth.
Yeah, that's something that Mike Johnson wants to avoid, but I've long thought it's unavoidable.
Well, by the way, the Speaker has an alternative, which is when the Senate passes our bill, the House can take it up and just pass it. I'd be okay with that.
He keeps saying there's no pride of authorship, so maybe he believes that.
By the way, there is a chance that happens. I'm not pressing for it. I actually think the conference process is a perfectly reasonable and productive and healthy process. So I'm fine with the conference. But if they decide they just want to pass what we do, that's fine too.
Spoken like a true senator. Okay, one last news of the day question.
That may be the cruelest thing that's ever been said about it.
The state of Texas, the Trump administration is asking, and this is a recent development, asking for Texas to change its congressional maps in the year 2025. A bit unusual. Texas has done it before. They think they could squeeze more Republican seats out of Texas. I don't know if you know this because you live there. Texas has a lot of Republican seats in the House of Representatives, a good amount. There's maybe a couple more they could put in play. There's risks there. Do you have a view on this situation?
So I have a couple of views. Number one, it is clear that Texas can do so if it wants to.
Legally, you mean?
Legally.
Yes, right.
And I say that from personal experience. So I was brand new as the Solicitor General of Texas in 2003, and in 2003, Texas did a new congressional redistricting, and it was immediately challenged in court, and I was the lead lawyer defending it. So I was the lawyer in the trial court along with others, and then in the Supreme Court, I argued the case, and we prevailed, and their central question was, you can't do mid-decade congressional redistricting. That position failed. So as a legal matter, Texas absolutely can do it. I don't have a view in terms of whether they should or not. At the end of the day, that's a question for the Texas legislature. The Constitution gives the legislature that authority. You know, I will say an interesting thing, Jake. You said, gosh, Texas has a lot of Republicans. The interesting thing about gerrymandering is Democrats are a hell of a lot better at it. So the state of Massachusetts, what do you think the balance is between Democrats and Republicans?
There are 0 Republicans in the House.
They have drawn the districts in Massachusetts so that Democrats have 100% of the congressional seats in Massachusetts. That's what Democrats do. And by the way, there's 40 to 45% of Massachusetts that are Republicans. If you actually were divvying it up on population, you would get 40 to 45%. But they don't. They draw it so only Democrats win. And so red states don't do that with near the brutality that blue states do. And so I don't know if Texas will do it. I understand why the White House is urging it. Look, gerrymandering is also something that has a natural check on it. Because if you're trying to draw seats to expand the number of seats that your party wins, it means you dilute the seats so that they're closer margins, which means in a bad year you could lose a bunch of seats. So there's a risk if you've got a set number of Republicans or Democrats in a state, you risk potentially losing seats by trying to expand the number of seats that are in play. You
dilute some of these Republican seats. Okay, let's talk about Spectrum, which obviously you are incredibly involved in, the lead person on spectrum policy. Washington failed to renew the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority when it expired in 2023, that is, and for 2 years we've had no new auctions.
Yep.
How urgent is it to reauthorize the FCC and get auctions moving again? And what message, we talk a lot about messages that we're sending to the world, that the United States is sending to the world. What message does this delay send globally about U.S. tech leadership?
So it's absolutely urgent. And we are in the midst of a whole series of races when it comes to technology and innovation. My number one priority in the Senate for 13 years that I've been there is jobs. And I am focused, laser focused on jobs, jobs, jobs. What does creating jobs mean? It means we need to win the major technology races. We need to win the race for 5G and 6G. We need to win the race for AI. We also need to win the race for space. All of those are squarely in the Commerce Committee's jurisdiction, and I am very focused on maintaining and expanding American leadership. We also need to win the race for energy. There are a host of issues, but when you look at 5G and 6G, if your top priority is jobs, there are very few policies that can have a greater impact on jobs than Spectrum. And it's interesting, when you talk about Spectrum, look, this is a highfalutin crowd that knows all about it. But when you talk to folks normally and you say Spectrum, their eyes glaze over and they're like, what the heck is that? And you know, listen, I try to explain. It's the wavelengths on which our phones and computers and Wi-Fi and satellites and everything communicates. It's how technology operates. And if you look at the mid-band spectrum, the most valuable spectrum in terms of communicating, over 60% of it right now is owned and controlled by the federal government. It is a massive percentage. And there is a reality in life that, by the way, the federal government doesn't pay for it, doesn't cost anything. So if you have an agency that has spectrum, it costs them nothing. It's incredibly valuable, but they don't pay for it. And there is, there's an old libertarian principle, Tonstoffel, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch.
Right.
If you don't pay for something, you don't value it. And so what happens for much of the federal spectrum is it is underutilized. But historically, every agency that has it fights to preserve it. And that's a natural bureaucratic instinct. If you have a resource, if there's an agency that has a bunch of federal buildings, even if the buildings are empty, they're like, no, damn it, we need these buildings. They're really important because we need them. That happens with spectrum also. And so if we are going to compete, there's a race to finish out 5G and then to dominate 6G. If we are going to compete and beat China, we've got to have sufficient spectrum to do so. And I will say one of the great failures of the Biden administration, and as you know, in my judgment at least, there are a lot of failures of the Biden administration.
I've heard you say that, yep.
But spectrum is right there. They simply said, we're fine. We are okay losing to China. America doesn't need to compete. We don't need to lead. We don't need jobs. We're okay just being at the back of the line. I think that was terrible. When we started reconciliation several months ago, I said then we're going to do spectrum. And I got to say, Jake, and you know this well because you follow this as closely as anybody, virtually everyone in the House and Senate laughed when I said we're going to do spectrum. And said there's no way we can do it. People are too dug in. It is in the House bill. It is going to be in the Senate bill. It is going to be in the final bill that is signed into law. And that's a big deal. That is a big deal because, number one, it is going to produce, I believe, north of $100 billion of direct revenue to the federal government. It's scored at $85 billion, but CBO historically has been way low on scoring this. And that's not $100 billion in sort of fake budget savings. You get sometimes accounting tricks where people say, oh, here's some money we're saving, and they're not real. That is real dollars that go in to offset the deficit and the debt. But even more importantly, unleashing spectrum is going to result in billions of dollars invested in building out 5G and 6G, and that is going to produce hundreds of thousands of jobs. And so in terms of policies in this bill, I think this is one of the biggest movers for job creation.
Let me ask you, you hinted at this, but you included auction authority and an 800 megahertz spectrum pipeline in the Commerce reconciliation title. You place some exclusions for national security spectrum, but some of the Republican hawks say it doesn't represent the agreement that you had with them. What do you need to do to seal that deal?
Deal's done.
Okay.
The deal's done. We stood on the Senate floor. We cut a deal. The deal is in the bill. I will say it's interesting. A couple of my colleagues keep running to you and giving quotes, but you know what?
Not me specifically, but yes, some people.
I will say this. None of them have said a damn word to me. We cut a deal. This is exactly the deal we cut. And it is interesting. Look, senators have different ways of expressing views. You can run to the press and put out a quote, and that's one way of doing it. You can have your staff go and throw a fit. That's another way of doing it. In my experience, the way things really move is adults talk to each other.
We're adults.
Sort of. I say that with love.
Yeah, I got you.
But we have a deal. This is precisely the deal that was cut. And it's going to be in the bill. And listen, at the end of the day, I'm not the only one that thinks that. There's a fellow named Donald J. Trump who's down the street who has likewise, when we cut the deal, so last week after we cut the deal, I get a call on the phone, and I talk to the president often, and it's the president in the Oval Office. He's sitting there with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and he's like, Ted, that's how he begins most of his conversations with me, Ted, this is a great deal. This is an incredible deal. How did you get such an amazing deal? Now, by the way,
it's because you read The Art of the Deal, right? Is that
well, the only right answer, Ken? You went exactly there. And my response was, well, Mr. President, we got it because of you, and that is the right answer to that. But it also happens to have enormous truth. So how did we get there? I'll tell you. 3 months ago, I sat in the Speaker's office. I said, we're going to do Spectrum. And Mike literally laughed at me. He said, there's no way on earth we'll get this done. Our hawks won't let us. It isn't going to happen. It's obviously in the House bill. And by the way, I want to give serious props to Brett Guthrie for getting it done in the House. That was not easy there. But one of the big elements of getting this deal, look, DOD and the intelligence community, both of whom have large spectrum allocations, they have historically fought ferociously effective. And under the Biden administration, they discovered a policy was just no, hell no, no, hell no. And they just did bureaucratic stonewall. And it worked. It's why we don't have Spectrum Auction Authority right now, because they were able to stonewall everything. And to be clear, when you talk about the hawks, I consider myself a hawk. I want to defend this country. I fight for DOD every day. I fight for the intelligence community. We need to be incredibly effective. So part of getting this done is winning the battle on the merits. So I've done multiple classified briefings. And I will tell you, when you see an array of the top brass in the intelligence community, and they say, oh, no, we can't give up. We can't give up any spectrum at all. The world will end. So there are two questions that I asked them. I'm not going to tell you what they said in the classified briefing, but I can tell you what I said. Two questions I asked them. I said, well, that's very interesting. You tell us the entire world will collapse, our radar won't work, planes will fall out of the sky, our spies won't be able to communicate, everything ends. If even 1 megahertz goes to commercial development. The two questions I asked them, I say, number one, there are over 50 countries on planet Earth that have auctioned off portions of this spectrum. Is it DOD's position that our military does not operate in the Pacific? Like, are we only able to defend Topeka, Kansas, which, by the way, is really hard to get to with an aircraft carrier? Like, if your position is we can't operate if there are commercial operators in spectrum, well, guess what? The whole planet Earth has done this already, and they don't have a response. It's not like they have a nuance. They're just like, okay, we don't like that question. By the way, Fort Bliss in Texas, El Paso, Texas. Mexico has auctioned off portions of the lower three. Fort Bliss is right on the Rio Grande River. You're telling me Fort Bliss is not able to operate because, and by the way, there's not a like magical electromagnetic wall. We have a wall, but it doesn't extend into spectrum.
So let me ask you about.
By the way, here's question two, because I don't.
Okay, yeah, I forgot that. Yep.
Question two, I asked them, all right, I want you to give me an answer from pure national security. Is it good or bad from national security if we lose the race for 6G and if the global telecom architecture is provided by China and Huawei? And I asked them, I said, how many of our servicemen and women use cell phones? The answer, by the way, is all of them. They all have cell phones. And if we have every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine, every phone call they have going through Huawei equipment that the Chinese can intercept and listen to, that is a disaster from national security perspectives. Again, Jake, they don't have an answer. And so their approach for the last 4 years under Biden has just been stonewall, stonewall, stonewall. What changed, and why I said it is accurate to say the president gets credit for it, is I spent the last 3 months making the case at the White House this is the right thing to do, and the president came out unequivocally and said we're going to do this. And that, at the end of the day, is how we got to yes. So
the Pentagon also worries about being forced, and I can predict your answer on this one, to surrender spectrum without fair compensation. And in addition to people urging caution on reallocating military bands. So is it your view? I mean, so I guess two questions here. How do we balance those national security needs with the push to open more airwaves for 5G? And what assurances does DOD need, and are you going to have to revisit some of this in the future? So, no, on the final point, although, look, I will say it is existing federal law that no federal spectrum can be reallocated without the current
user of that spectrum, number one, finding an equivalent alternative band, and number two, being compensated at 110% of the cost of shifting to that band. That's existing federal law. This is not changing in the deal. And so the process that's set up, look, part of what we did, I did not want to get Congress in the business of deciding what bands to allocate, in part because I serve in the United States Senate, a body where the median age is 106. This is not a technologically savvy group. Just a few years ago, I had a colleague of mine refer to the internet as a collection of tubes.
Yes, I remember.
So this, if we were trying to allocate spectrum, God help us. So I wanted to keep us out of this business. Socrates, one of the wisest men who ever lived, what he did know is what he didn't know, which gave him that wisdom. Congress doesn't know how to allocate spectrum. What we do know how to do, hopefully, is to legislate and create a process. Depending on the day, yeah. where we don't always know, but this creates a process. It'll be led by NTIA. All of the federal stakeholders will have a seat at the table to engage in the technical arguments about what spectrum can be reallocated and what the alternative uses are. That process will play out, and it will be beneficial. Now, the House had a whole series of exclusions. It was my view, I don't like exclusions, and so the bill that I'd filed initially was a pipeline that would free up 600 megahertz with no exclusions at all. Now, I will say the president sent a tweet that was incredibly helpful, that he said, we're going to free up 600 megahertz with no exclusions. And that language, no exclusions, was really important. And as I said, it was a 3-month battle in the White House. That was not a tweet that he just pulled out his phone and typed. That was the process of an interagency battle that played out at the White House that manifested in that tweet. Now, at the very end, the way we got this done is we had, standing in the back of the Senate, not on the mics, but just on the floor of the Senate is actually where we negotiated it. We had a meeting with Roger Wicker and Tom Cotton. Roger's the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Tom is the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. So they're the lead two people. And then the two other senators who care deeply about this are Mike Rounds and Deb Fischer. And so the five of us stood in the back and cut a deal. They were pushing for broader exemptions. What I ended up doing was giving an exemption for the lower three, which is where DOD is primarily focused. And then also in the House, they had an exception from 7.25 to 8.4 for DOD and the intelligence community. I thought that exemption was too broad. And so I said I'm willing to do 7.4 to 8.4. That frees up another 125 megahertz. They agreed to it, but I'll tell you, Jake, my view when I'm cutting deals, and in my time in the Senate, I've authored and passed 103 pieces of legislation into law. When I cut deals, I'm transparent and transactional, and so I don't give up anything for nothing. And so, all right, you want exclusions? I'm looking at the president's tweet, which I had printed out. By the way, I've got the president's tweet printed out right here. And I had it in front of him, and I said, well, you know, this...
he likes the deal as is.
Well, this is the first tweet where he says, let's make sure all options are on the table, which meant no exclusions. And I showed it to them and said, well, I get that you're fighting for DOD and the IC, but the president disagrees with you. But I said, all right, we'll give these exclusions. But I said, instead of 600 megahertz, let's make it 800 megahertz. And I got to admit that I think was a surprise. Nobody was talking about 800 megahertz. But I asked for it because if I'm going to give in on exclusions, I wanted to gain something. And the benefit of an additional 200 megahertz is enormous in terms of freeing up spectrum for investment in dominating and winning 6G and creating jobs.
So I'm being told by my staff and your staff that we're out of time. So I think I'm going to take the hint. But I have one more question before we officially get the hook. The wireless industry says it just needs the right spectrum and policies to keep innovating and building out 5G. And in your view, what role should government play or not play in fostering private sector innovation besides freeing up more spectrum? Are there policies that could either spur or hinder U.S. companies as they deploy 5G and develop 6G?
So look, absolutely yes. If you care about jobs, what I understand is that jobs are not created by Washington. They're not created by government bureaucrats. They're not created by Congress. Jobs are created by entrepreneurs putting capital at risk to meet a need. But what Congress can do, what Washington can do, is screw that up badly. And if you want to create an environment where jobs are plentiful, the two best levers that government has are tax reform, which we're right in the middle of, and reg reform. And so on both of those, I am looking to simplify the tax code, to reduce burdens on job creators, and to simplify and reduce job-killing regulations. Both of those are enormously important. Winning the race to 5G and 6G is huge, but you asked what other policies in terms of job creation. Look, I think a sleeper issue in this last election was AI. AI is utterly transformational. You may have seen last year, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal with Phil Gramm, dear friend of mine, extraordinary former senator. And we did something that may surprise you. We actually praised a Democrat president. We praised Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was president when the internet was just being developed. And Bill Clinton signed an executive order that memorialized a light touch regulatory approach to the internet. And it was utterly historic because at the same time, the EU, the European Union, adopted a very heavy regulatory approach that required prior approval before innovation. The consequence of that decision, in 1993, the American economy and the EU's economy were virtually identical in size. Today, the American economy is more than 50% larger than the EU. Mm-hmm. And the two drivers of that were tech and the shale revolution. That decision changed our lives. Our families are wealthier, our economy, our society is wealthier. There's more jobs, there's more prosperity because of that decision. I think AI is at least as consequential a shift in our country as the internet was. And we were facing the same debate. And the position of Joe Biden and the Democrats is they said, let's follow Europe's approach and adopt a prior approval nanny state regulatory approach. Before any innovation, you got to go to Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and say, Mother, may I? You had the Biden AI executive order, the AI EIO, as I call it, that is the largest executive order in U.S. history and almost guaranteed that America would lose the race for AI. I think this was a sleeper issue in the last election because one of the very first things Trump did upon winning is repeal the AI executive order from Biden. And one of the differences with my now having the gavel of the Commerce Committee is we are not going to have a heavy-handed regulatory approach to AI because we've got to beat China. Now, by the way, are there risks to AI? Sure. All technology has risks. And powerful technology has powerful risks. But at the end of the day, I'm not a Luddite. I don't think we're going to stop the development of technology. Nuclear weapons. If I could wave a magic wand, would nuclear weapons disappear from planet Earth? Yes. But I can't. And so if they're going to be nuclear weapons, I damn sure want us to have big badass ones to deter someone else from using them. The same principle is true on AI. If they're going to be killer robots in the world, I'd much rather they be American killer robots than Chinese.
Yeah, I get it.
And so my approach to all of these issues, whether it is spectrum, whether it is AI, whether it is space, is I want America to win. And I think the policies we're enacting are designed to maximize the chances of America winning and America leading.
To avoid your staff coming up here and tackling me, I'm going to say thank you very much, Senator Cruz. I appreciate the time. Thank you, sir. And now, the encore to that, I don't know if there could be an encore, is CTIA CEO Ajit Pai. Thank you, sir. I don't know if you could, can you follow that up?
That's a very hard act to follow. Badass robots.
If we're going to have killer robots and badass nuclear weapons. So you not only are leading on this right now at CTIA, but you had this was your job in the previous Trump administration just years ago. So let's dive right in. You oversaw spectrum auctions.
Yeah.
And those policies as FCC chair during the Trump administration, culminating in landmark moves like the C-band auction. In hindsight, what were some of the biggest lessons you learned about spectrum management from that period? And how do those lessons shape your view now on what the U.S. must do to win the race to 5G and 6G?
Well, great question. I think you heard some intimations of that in Senator Cruz's remarks. Part of it involves presidential leadership. In 2019, the president and I held an event in the Roosevelt Room where he put a stamp on this very issue. Very unusual for presidents to get involved in wireless policy, but he put a priority on it. And he said, we want America to lead the world in 5G and next generation wireless technologies. And that really gave the FCC, which I was leading, as you mentioned, the support, the intellectual and political support to conduct the most aggressive spectrum auction program in history. Fast forward 4 years to a new administration, and that's exactly what the president is doing again. I know it sounds odd to say through that tweet he really set the stage, but he did by setting a marker. We need 600 megahertz of licensed mid-band spectrum without any exclusions, and that gave Senator Cruz and his allies in the Senate, and as well as Brett Guthrie in the House, the ballast to be able to do what they're doing now in reconciliation. So I really salute the heroic leadership of elected officials on this issue. The other part of it is not just aspirational, of course, getting this into law, but doing. And so the FCC, when I was leading it, we put a priority on not just saying the right things, but doing the right things. And then sometimes there was going to be friction with other agencies and even between branches. But at the end of the day, the American people were the beneficiaries, putting the public airwaves to work for the public. And that's exactly what's happening now with Chairman Carr working very closely with the Commerce Secretary, with others in the White House. That kind of orientation towards action is going to be absolutely vital if and when, not if, but when, reconciliation, including Senator Cruz's pipeline and auction authority, gets into the statute books.
Hopefully by July 4th, but Senator Cruz was a little bit more bearish than I was.
I mean, to be clear, we'll take it sooner, but that's fine. We'll wait till July 4th.
Let's talk about Congress. So this has spectrum has now become part of budget debates. I mean, this is kind of going, it has been in the past. We've heard it, raised during, government funding debates in the past. Does tying spectrum auctions to budget deals help drive progress, or could it complicate things when they're mixed in with budget policy?
I mean, certainly we would appreciate evergreen auction authority, right. Pipeline that lasts for decades.
More predictability.
More predictability is great, of course, for the innovators that are working with these building blocks of wireless networks. But on the other hand, I think we come to the table with a very unusual set of assets that are appealing to elected officials. Number one, as you heard from Senator Cruz, this is one of the key drivers of economic growth and job creation in the United States. But more importantly, number two, we demonstrated during the previous administration that spectrum auctions generate enormous benefits for the American public, including through the Treasury. In fact, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that this is, in terms of fiscal impact, the most significant government program in American history. In the last 4 years, generating over $100 billion in auction revenue. In the history of the auction program, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so I think when we come to the table, when we've had very productive conversations with members on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress, they have an open ear to us because we come saying, we don't want something from you, we're willing to give something to you. The more spectrum that you auction for the benefit of the American public, the more dollars can be used for reconciliation. And so I think that's a useful pay for, in addition to the fact that it's just generally good for economic innovation and for the wireless consumers that are out there relying on this increasingly every day.
Yeah, so what key steps do you want to see the Trump administration take now? So, for example, are there specific bans, timelines, or reforms you'd urge NTIA and the FCC to prioritize so the U.S. keeps the momentum on 5G?
Well, certainly assuming that Senator Cruz's pipeline approach holds, which we, of course, hope it will, that gives us a good roadmap for the future. But in the meantime, once the FCC's auction authority is reestablished, Chairman Carr has already charted a pretty aggressive agenda on wireless issues. AWS-3, for example, C-band, the upper C-band, which is the counterpart to the first part of the C-band auction that we auctioned in 2020. So I think that's going to be really important for them to move on in the near term. And in the mid to long term, of course, all of those different mid-band spectrum assets that Senator Cruz just talked about that are really useful. That's the sweet spot for 5G. When I left office in 2021, the U.S. was leading the world in terms of 5G availability using those bands. And now we've kind of sunk behind China, believe it or not. And so this would help us right the ship in a way that's absolutely critical.
You led me very neatly into my next question. it's oftentimes framed that spectrum is a national security issue. And both in competing with adversaries and safeguarding our military communications. One FCC official noted the U.S. has about 380 megahertz of mid-band spectrum for 5G, while China has roughly 4 times more. Do you share concerns that America risks falling behind, and how do we free up crucial spectrum for commercial use and to protect vital federal systems at the same time?
I'm tremendously concerned about it. When I left office, we were essentially at par with China in terms of the amount of spectrum that is available in mid-band. And as you pointed out, that's now a 4x gap, which is tremendous. And I know it sounds to the average person kind of abstract. What do we care if China is 400 or 1,000 megahertz ahead of us? But it's sort of the network effects that flow from that. So going back a ways, I know it's hard to remember because we live in the day-to-day, but in the 4G economy, where the United States led in the development of LTE, that came along with a tremendous amount of wireless innovation and investment. The app economy as we know it was built on America's mobile platform because we had those spectrum assets in place for companies to be able to innovate around. The same thing is going to happen with 5G and 6G, and arguably even to a greater extent because of AI and some of the other technologies that Senator Cruz talked about, which are going to rely increasingly on mobile platforms. And so the country that leads, the region that leads in terms of wireless spectrum policy is going to get all the benefits that flow from that. And for better or worse, I would argue for worse, the Chinese have placed a major priority on not just domination in 5G, but all of the other adjacent technologies like AI. And they're choosing national champions like Huawei and ZTE to help lead the charge. And so it's not enough for us to say we can rely on this implicit notion that America is always going to lead the world no matter what the policy is. We have to be proactive and aggressive in competing with China and other regional and national rivals. And this is a critical part in doing that.
Looking ahead, 6G is on the horizon. You touched on that, and carriers are already starting to prepare for 6G services. What should we be doing now to lay the groundwork for 6G? And will the next generation require new spectrum bands or policy approaches? And how could the U.S. set itself up now, to lead in 6G like we are trying to do in 5G?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that I like to do is start with consumer demand and work backwards. And so, for example, in 2023, the amount of mobile data that consumers used was twice as much as it was in 2021. An Accenture study has recently suggested that if we don't make sufficient mid-band spectrum available, there's going to be a 25% gap in terms of the amount of demand that we can satisfy in terms of AI. And that's going to magnify by 3x by 2029. And so the one constant in the consumer wireless experience during the commercial internet has been we're always using more. And that's going to magnify with some of the things that we've talked about, like AI, AR, VR, different things like that. And so, again, working back from that from 2029 or the long term back, that means we need to put in place the policies now to accommodate that rise in use. Spectrum policy doesn't happen in a day or a week. Senator and his colleagues could pass a bill tomorrow that doesn't make the spectrum available. It takes a long time for the expert agency, the FCC, as well as other federal agencies to coordinate, to get the spectrum to market, for incumbents to clear, for companies to actually put the radios and other infrastructure in place. So it's a years-long process. It takes a long time. And so one of the things we're focused on as the wireless industry is making sure we put the building blocks of innovation in place now so we don't find ourselves scratching our heads in 2029 wondering, how on earth do we stop this lag time that consumers are facing or enable these entrepreneurs to innovate even though there's not sufficient spectrum available? We want to put the building blocks in place now so that they will be able to deliver a seamless wireless experience in the years to come.
Last question before I get the hook. You posted on X about meeting with White House officials just hours before President Trump issued the now famous tweet that Ted Cruz had printed out and in his pocket, which, by the way, I was telling you backstage, I mean, our reporters, Ben and Diego, are in the front row. They cover this policy for us. I remember them being quite surprised by this as well and seeing that tweet. But let me ask, did you meet with the president before he issued that tweet? And what have your dealings with the White House been?
What I can say is,
that's a famous way of saying it. What you can say, go ahead.
These aren't the droids you're looking for. I'll just leave it at that. No, but we've had tremendous conversations with officials in the White House at various agencies, and I think they share the president's orientation towards action and delivering results for the American people. And one of the things I'm very grateful to the president for when I was chairman and in this term as well, now that I'm on the outside, is that he really puts a premium on America winning some of these key technological races. He wants us to be able to deliver world-class wireless networks to the American people. He wants infrastructure to be able to be built in the United States and streamlining some of the regulations that stand in the way of that. And writ large, he wants America to deliver on the promise of economic growth and job creation, which technology increasingly is intertwined with. So I'm very grateful to the president for taking a leadership role on this. As I said, it's exceptionally unusual for a president to weigh in on wireless policy the way he did. But I think you're getting a sense in this one narrow field about his general orientation, that whether it's 5G or AI, he wants America to win. And that is certainly a mission that we share 100%.
But the current chair of the FCC, and I'll say this before wrapping up, Brendan Carr, climbed a power pole and posted a photo on X. I don't remember you doing that.
Oh, you should. I did indeed. A 133-foot tower in rural Colorado. I climbed up. And,
so I'm wrong.
In my wingtips, and of course, these young whippersnappers now, he's climbing 2,000-foot towers and pretending like it's nothing. So, but no,
kudos to you, because there's no chance I would have ever done that.
It's terrifying. I got to the top of my tower, and the thing seemed to be swaying, and I thought we were going to tip over. And the tower climber who's with me said, oh, yeah, this is just a pretty mild 20, 30 mile an hour wind. I've been up here when it's 70, 80. But the tower climbers who are out there do fantastic work. And I think that's one of the great things that Chairman Carr is doing, is marrying an intellectual framework that is very forward thinking with a very practical appreciation for the people who are doing the hard work, actually connecting Americans. So he is in far better shape than I am, and he's a much more ambitious agenda than I do. So I see it as my goal to help the chairman achieve his goals, which are very important for the American people.
Thank you to CTIA and Ajit Pai for making this conversation possible. Thank you to Ted Cruz for joining us earlier, and I appreciate you all being here. Check out punchbowl.news for more event news and more news, and have a great day, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. This is great. Really appreciate it.